Hello and welcome to Wilson Center Now, a production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. I'm John Molesky. My guest today is Blair Ruble. Blair is currently a Distinguished Fellow at the Wilson Center. He previously served as Director of the Kennan Institute for Advanced Russian Studies, Director of the Center's Comparative Urban Studies Program, Director of the Program on Global Sustainability and Resilience, and he also served as Vice President of Programs and Director of the Urban Policy Laboratory. All of those credentials, impressive and important, but they all take second place today to his role as an author of his latest book, Proclaiming Presence from the Washington Stage. Blair, welcome back. Great to see you.
Thank you, John. Good to be here. Good to see you.
So in looking at the book and reading the book, it strikes me that you're now into this, it's almost a series. Where one book feeds into the other. There's overlap in the stories and what's happening within the arts community of DC. Do you see it yourself as a series? And how did the idea for this book emerge?
Well, I hadn't thought about it as a series until the publisher put a very similar cover on this book as on the last book. And now it even physically looks like a series. What I've been doing is following up leads from previous projects, and my first foray into Washington was a history of U Street, and I kept coming across the Howard University players in that story, but I never really followed up on it. So I had the opportunity to begin to dig into archives at Howard. And that eventually led to expanding the story to Catholic U and Arena Stage and the DC Black Rep. And with extensive archival research on both Arena Stage and the Howard Players.
And Blair, the title, the notion of proclaiming presence, what's the idea behind that? Who is doing the proclaiming and what's the necessity?
The idea is that Washington, in lots of ways, is not an unusual city. Like other nation capitals, there's the tension between hometown and national. It's a border city between North and South, like Baltimore and St. Louis and Louisville. But one way in which Washington stands out is it had no local politics for a century, and for most of the period I'm looking at. And it's not that issues went away, it was that there were no institutions which gave voice to the residents of the city. And I found that theater became one of the ways in which local groups who wanted to say, hey, we're here too, pay attention to us, could find their voice and let the world know that they indeed are here.
So you take this city, as you say, similar to others in many ways, but then completely singularly unique as the nation's capital, where everyone feels they have some stake in it, and then the representation or taxation without representation, these things that make it different. So how does a city like this, what was historically a sleepy southern town, become a theater capital to rival Broadway?
Well, it's interesting. Yes, Washington was always throughout most of the 20th century a sleepy southern town. I think many of us came here at a time when it felt that way. But in fact, there always has been a vibrant arts community, often in the African American community. And I was involved in the history of DC jazz scene. My book on U Street really explored some of the ways in which the African American community actually was quite vibrant and contributed a great deal to broader American culture, but it was always kind of overlooked because it was, in part because it was African American, also because it was in this sleepy southern town. So it turns out if we take just the Howard Players, leaving aside the larger story, I tell the story of an effort to create a national Negro theater in the 1920s in response to the earlier policies of Woodrow Wilson, which enforced segregation. And in that story, there are around 10 people who are now on US postage stamps. So these are people who actually had a much larger impact than they were given credit for. And even now, when I go around and talk about the book, many people are totally ignorant of the remarkable Howard University story in the teens and 20s. And there are lots of reasons for this, but there's another dimension to this. I mean, some of the people on postage stamps are now talked about regularly, but not in connection with Washington and with the Washington scene. So I think there are two issues. And obviously, there's no getting around the fact that race is at the core of a lot of the tensions. And it is, even when we get to the stories about Catholic University and Arena Stage, the reality is that race really matters. Another part of it is people don't think of Washington as a theater town. And it's interesting. One of the reasons for that is major playwrights and directors and producers boycotted the city following World War II for up to a half dozen years because of Jim Crow laws. So Paul Robeson would come to Washington, he would speak in Washington, but he wouldn't perform in Washington because of Jim Crow laws. So part of it is the theater scene that grew up under the radar because Washington really wasn't, the major American theater community was staying away from the city in the late 40s, early 50s. That begins to change dramatically in the 50s.
You know, whether we talk about Hollywood dominated by the film industry, or Silicon Valley and the tech industry, or Hershey, Pennsylvania, and chocolate, towns are often defined by their dominant industry. And the dominant industry here is of course, politics and government. How does that interact with the world of the arts? Is DC art then, as a result, more political than the average towns?
I think it is, and I think it plays out in the story I tell in two ways. One, going back to this notion that theater and the arts became a substitute for political life. That was directly political. But also, I think in terms of what Washington audiences respond to, I think as we begin to get later in the story towards when Washington is becoming a major national theater center at the end of the 20th century, a lot of that theater either has an implicit political cast or even an explicit one. People perform Shakespeare to tell political stories in Washington in ways in which they don't elsewhere. So I think politics is a big part of this too.
Sorry to step on your last words there, Blair. My sense is, in reading the story, is that there's an element of any port in a storm, in that if you can't find footage or traction in the political world because of your lack of representation, you find another outlet.
I think that's the story, and that ties into a larger point I return to over and over again, which is the arts are terribly important for as I talk about in this book, proclaiming presence, giving a voice, however you want to put it. But the arts give expression, particularly at moments when other avenues are closed, give expression to people's feelings, wishes, desires, goals, and a very important one. And stepping back from theater, I think when we were looking at the DC jazz scene, this notion of expression, giving expression to people who otherwise couldn't express themselves, is an important part of the Washington story. But I think this is a larger function of the arts that often gets brushed aside or overlooked. Do
we underestimate its power, consequently?
I absolutely think we underestimate its power. And part of this is spending my career as a Soviet specialist and studying the Soviet Union. And I don't want to overstate this, but you can make a credible case that music, in particular jazz and rock and roll, brought down the Soviet system. You can make a credible case that the Taganka Theater's performance of Hamlet in 1970 started a process that ended with Glasnost. This isn't the only part of the story, but they're important parts of the story. And we tend to think of the arts in more commercial terms here, so we kind of miss this part of the story. So taking that the sensitivities I gained in looking at the Soviet situation and bringing it here, I began to see things which maybe others don't.
Mhm. Blair, I don't want to give it all away, right? We want people to go out and buy the book and read the book.
Absolutely.
But there are four major storylines that culminate in the thematic ties that bind. And what I want to ask you is, when you think about it in retrospect, is there a particular story or perhaps individual that best represents thematically the larger tale that you're telling?
Well, I think there probably are there are four individuals, one from each story, I think really reveal the story. One is Thomas Montgomery Gregory, who founded the Howard Players and was promoting a style of theater which was oriented towards telling the African American story by African Americans to African Americans, but embedding it in a larger theatrical tradition. His vision was tied to the National Theatre in Ireland. So it's this nexus between his local and more, one could say, parochial concern with giving voice to African Americans, but doing so through mechanisms that he came to respect and find nourishment in from abroad. The second is Father Gilbert Hartke, who established the program at Catholic University. And he also looked to the Irish theater as a way of creating a theater that would speak to Catholic values. But Hartke's efforts very quickly expanded into really transforming American theater. And he becomes an important player because he was a mentor to a number of other people who came along, including Zelda Fichandler, who established Arena Stage. And then the final character, Robert Hooks, who founded DC Black Rep, was is a towering figure in African American theater, and he happened to have grown up in the city, so he intersects with this story in different ways. But once you hit the Catholic U story, the Arena story, and DC Black Rep very definitely intersect with all the other stories. The Howard story is a little bit earlier.
And speaking of when these things occur, you mentioned earlier that there's a lot of archival research involved. What about talking to individuals? Are there people still active or alive in the DC area, or that you had access to, who are part of the stories?
Absolutely. And that's a big part of it. And one of the people who really embraced this project was Thomas Montgomery Gregory's daughter, who's in her 80s. And it's this remarkable span between her father and her that extends well over a century of engagement with Washington, with the arts in Washington. She actually was involved in television here.
I wanted to ask you, Blair, about the dedication. Who is Philip Arnell, and why did you choose to dedicate the book to him?
Well, Philip is a major figure in Baltimore theater. He established a major regional theater in Baltimore, and then later in his life, he became very active in international theater exchange. And he runs an organization that has had major efforts both with Eastern Europe and with Africa, and linking theater artists abroad with theater artists in the US. And his idea is that these international experiences will enrich American theater. Philip is this kind of legendary figure, and he happened to study at Catholic U. And in a way, he prompted this book because, as I say in the dedication, we would go to Baltimore Orioles games together, and as the Orioles would begin invariably to tank about halfway through the game, we would start talking about theater, and Philip is very involved in Russian theater, so that's where it started. But he led me back to the Washington story. He's a remarkable figure.
Blair, those of us who know you understand how you have become such a part of the fabric of DC's past and its present. And part of that is professional as an urbanist, but obviously those of us who know there's a great personal interest and commitment as well. So tell people who are watching who only know DC as a faraway capital or a place to visit on field trips, what are the things that you know about this city and appreciate about this city that you think are lost on the larger population?
Well, I grew up in New York and I went to school in Canada, but I arrived here in the late 1970s, so it's become home. And when I was running the Kennan Institute, we would host scholars from Russia and Ukraine, and invariably they would say what a wonderful city Washington is, how vibrant it is, how in many cases they kind of liked it better than New York because New York is overpowering. And what a great music scene and art scene and all the museums. And I realized most Americans don't think of Washington that way. And then as I began to poke around, maybe John, you've gotten these questions too. You'd go out into the world and you say you're from Washington, and invariably they would say, well, nobody's from Washington, or
Yes.
what suburb do you live in? But there are tens of thousands of people who were born in the city and grew up here. And they, in many cases, happen to be African American, and that story never really gets out. And if you just come to town and engage official Washington, it never becomes a real place. But if you go out, and in our case, it was listening to jazz, but there are any number of ways you could engage with Washington that just get you out of official Washington, and you realize, this is, now it's a metropolitan region of more than 5 million people. It's a post-industrial economic powerhouse. The city has been growing again. It has a great, Michelin just gave 4 additional restaurant stars. It has a great food scene. It is an exciting place to live if you look for it. It's not quite like New York or LA where you go there because these are exciting cities, but it's a remarkable place, and it took me a while to figure that out, but I've been here long enough.
No, I had the same experience. It took me a little while to figure it out, and my city of initial reference in the world was New York City as well.
Right.
So fast forwarding to today, as we return to the themes of the book and the art scene, and where Black theater lives now, and if there's still a place for it in the modern world, how do you see DC's theater scene today as it relates to the legacy that you outline in the book?
Well, what's really interesting and perplexing is that there is no main professional African American stage in this city. Robert Hooks' effort to create DC Black Rep, which had sent a large number of very talented people to Hollywood and Broadway and London. In that sense, it was a success. But as a theater enterprise, it failed. It only lasted 4 years. And there have been efforts to create a Black theater in Washington that never quite get off the ground. And I think there are complicated reasons for that. But what's happened now, particularly in light of the last 2 years, is that the efforts of a place like Arena Stage to incorporate diversity in their performances and in their storytelling has now spread across the Washington theater world. And that's all laudable, and it's really very good, and hiring practices have changed, but it's not quite the same thing as having a kind of home base for Black theater in Washington. The absence of that kind of professional center still is here. Now we'll have to see moving forward. Howard University is undergoing a renaissance, and they've made really impressive faculty appointments, and they're getting good students. Howard may become the vehicle that begins to carry it forward as it did 100 years ago. But it's a little bit of a challenge for a city that, after all, has one of the largest African American middle classes in the country, has deep cultural traditions, it just shouldn't be this hard. But I think there are structural reasons for this. These aren't individual failures. It has to do with how money is generated for the arts, audiences, tepid government support, particularly local government support for local arts. Historically, most of the arts funding in the city has gone to more national-oriented institutions. So these are battles which are now being rejoined, and we'll have to see how it plays out.
Well, there's an investment opportunity out there for people with bigger checkbooks than you and I. And I'm sure if it happens, you'll be chronicling it.
Well, the talent, the important thing is the talent is here. So it really is, there are a couple of dots that need to be connected. But it's not like this is sterile soil for any of the arts.
Well, Blair, speaking of connecting dots, you do a great job of that in all of your works. Thank you for the latest. Great pleasure to speak with you about it, and continued success to you.
Thank you, John. I really enjoyed our conversation and look forward to continuing.
We'll do it again. Thanks, Blair.
Okay.
We hope that all of you watching enjoyed as much as we did, and that you'll read the book and visit us again for another episode of Wilson Center Now. Until then, for all of us at the Center, I'm John Molesky. Thanks for watching.